Check. Got some wood, we've got a sander. If you do many projects, you know nothing good is about to happen that any woodworker really enjoys unless you're some type of deranged psychopath. But anyways, sanding is critically important, but it's also really easy to screw up, and it's something we don't talk about a lot because it seems like a no-brainer. You just move the sandpaper over the wood, it makes it smooth, right? Well, yes and also no. If you want your finish to come out right, the two main reasons your finishes fail, you didn't follow the instructions on the back of the can of whatever finish you're using. And one of those instructions is sand properly. Maybe might not say properly, but that's kind of assumed you're gonna sand properly. And if you're not, your finish just isn't gonna look good. And depending on your sheen, especially if you're doing a nice glossy finish, whew, every sanding mistake is just gonna be right there. Swirl marks, it's not gonna be even, it's gonna be bad. We'll go through a lot of the common mistakes and then go through good technique to help you sand your projects well and properly. First, let's talk about some common issues I see a lot of people that I used to maybe be guilty of. We'll do angle change. Obviously, your first mistake is not using the machines and paper from the companies that sponsor me. So fix that. Actually, I'm kidding. Well, I do work with Surf Prep and I have discount codes below, so feel free. It's really good equipment. That was a joke, by the way. You can laugh. It's okay. We're gonna go over some really common bad sanding technique that I've had to have corrected out of me. Don't raise your hand. Don't confess this to anyone. Just in privacy of your own home, reflect where the shoe, if it fits, and correct yourself in the privacy of your own shop. But yeah, here we go. How not to sand. So that's all bad technique. Let's sum it up and talk just very simply through what good technique is with a sander. Keep it flat. That's good for your pad, so you don't wear your pad out. It helps your sanding stay flat so you don't make dishes or unflat surfaces, which especially if you're going for that glossy sheen, you're gonna see anywhere your piece isn't flat later. Also, you don't need excessive pressure. The weight of the sander is plenty for the paper to do its cutting. Hold it there is all you have to do. Next, the reason you're using a power sander is so you don't have to save by hand, so you don't have to work. So if you're hand sanding, yeah, you gotta work that thing. But this is like spinning and orbiting and doing voodoo and all kinds of stuff. So move about an inch a second. It's about, you know, 2 fingers on a 1/1000, 1 Mississippi. That's about the speed. Should look about like this. Just a relaxing, easy process. Shouldn't be stressed out. Really easy. Hey, what's up, dude? So we talked about the technique of using the other common mistake that isn't really a technique, it's more of a mindset you need to get out of, is change your paper when it's dull. There's this myth that floats out, which is very misguided, saying, oh, sandpaper doesn't really go bad, it just gets a higher grit as it wears down. Utterly false, and that makes no sense when you think about it. The reason sandpaper works is it is the grit it is, which is coarser or finer based off the size of the particles that do the cutting action. But they do the cutting action because they're sharp. When your 80 grit or whatever grit paper stops cutting as well and starts cutting slower and slower, it's not because it magically turned into 100 grit or 150 grit or 200 grit. The edges just got dull. When you think, oh, well, my 80 is just like a 150 now. Actually, if you grabbed a new, fresh, sharp sheet of 150, is gonna cut way faster than that dull 80. Why? Because the 80 didn't turn into 150. I mean, it makes as much sense as saying, when my big chisel gets dull, it turns into a small chisel. No, it's not gonna cut as good. Buy good paper and treat it like cheap paper. So when your sanding starts to slow down, tear it off, throw a new one on. Sandpaper is not that expensive. And you're gonna have better results that way for another reason, which is dull paper doesn't cut. It's not sanding, it's burnishing. We'll talk more about that later. And you don't wanna burnish the wood, you wanna sand it, you wanna cut it. So when it gets dull, throw it off, put on a fresh pad. Also, this one isn't really a mistake, but if you can. Sand with a vacuum, with a dust extractor. Even before I had fancy premium sanders and I was just using like a big box store sander, I got the adapter and I hooked that thing up to my shop vac before I even had like a dust extractor or dust collector, just a shop vac and a big box store vacuum. That's normally possible, even if they're not really made for vacuums. If they have a bag, you can get an adapter and get a hose on there. Why? Well, those little bag systems, they don't pull the dust away from the sanding pad and into the dust near as well as any type of vacuum is going to draw dust away from the surface if it's actually drawing a vacuum. And that matters because if all you're doing is building up a pile of dust real quick that you cut and then just pushing that pile of dust around on your wood, you're not going to be sanding very efficiently or effectively. You're going to waste a lot of time and just dull your paper. So if you can sand with a vacuum, besides being healthier and cleaner and less messier, you're going to sand better and faster. So get a vacuum, hook up a vacuum, invest in the sanding system when you can. In my opinion, once you have all the baseline tools and you're doing all the things you need, a premium sander should be one of the first premium upgrades you make in your shop. Now, as far as patterns and how long to sand, that's also important. Whenever you sand, you want to overlap by 50%, same as if you're doing any spray finishing. Because imagine with this circle here, the edges, as we're moving that about inch per second, aren't going to see near as much sanding contact as anything across the middle of the disc. Anything in this path is going to get sanded a whole lot more than this. So to balance that out across the project so you don't have well sanded, barely sanded, kind of sanded, well sanded, barely sanded, what we'll do on this piece, say, is probably start half on and then come to the edge and then overlap where the edge of the sander was with the new middle. So yeah, 50% overlap, pretty easy. And the other thing about how long to sand, there's a lot of swirly marks because I intentionally kind of laid onto it while I was sanding some to get some swirl marks to show. Often it's from pushing too hard, sometimes it just happens, and if your sander has a larger orbital pattern, it's more likely to do that. And ideally you can just do one pass and you're good. But the key is whatever scratch marks you have from the lower grit, if they're visible and having a bright raking light coming from the side really helps you see those, you want to sand until those previous grit scratches are gone. Because if I keep moving through the grits, let's say I started with 80 grit and I go to 120 grit and I don't get rid of the 80 grit scratches. Well, when I go to 180 grit and I've still got 80 grit scratches, those 120 grit scratches will go away pretty quick, but it's going to take me even longer to get rid of the 80 grit scratches with 180 than it would have with 120. So I shouldn't have moved on until all those 80 grit scratches are gone. Hope that makes sense. So I've got, those are made with a 60. I've got an 80 on right now. We'll sand till hopefully those go away and move on with the proper overlap, which looks like such. So now I'm just hitting it with my raking side light to see if those scratches are gone, and I don't see them. So that means I'm safe to move up to my higher grit, because we don't want to finish the job at that level. So along those lines of making sure we remove all the scratches from the previous grit before we move on to a higher grit is what grits do we use? Well, it depends on how bad your material is. Let's say you've already ran it through a planer. If your planer leaves pretty nice smooth surfaces, you can probably start at about a 120. That's fine. My planer tends to leave little tracks from a misalignment with the cutter teeth or something. So I normally start with an 80 to knock those down pretty quick. So that's just kind of personal preference where you start. If you need to start all the way down at like 40 or something and work your way up. What grit you go to next is important. You don't need to walk through every single grit, but you never want to skip more than one step. So for example, grits often go from 60, 80, 100, 120, 150, 180. I can go from 60 to 100 and only skip 80. I wouldn't want to go from 60 to 120 because then I'm skipping 2. Wouldn't want to go from 80 to 150. I'm skipping 2, but 80 to 120 is fine. But it is not necessary to go 60, 80, 100, 120, 150 because the similarity is so close. All you're doing is spending a whole lot more time sanding than you need to, because you might think, oh, well, if I keep them closer, I can sand faster. And maybe because I can sand faster, I won't have to sand as long, and overall total time is gonna, flesh out better. It won't, because you still can only move your sander so fast. If you start moving the sander too fast, you're gonna get swirly marks, and the idea is to not get swirly marks. That about inch per second is the right speed, and that lets you skip one grit. said, well, then why do we have so many grits? Basically, that just depends on what material you're sanding. It gives you more options of where to start from. Softer woods versus harder woods. You know, maybe 80 is a little more coarse than where you want, but 120 is gonna take longer. So 100 is kind of the right place to be for whatever step in the process you're using, what wood you have, etc. That's why they exist. But it's totally fine in your shop, and this is what I do. I don't stock every grit, right? I generally keep 80, 120, 180, and 220 on hand. That's kind of my go-to, and I normally have like 320 and 400, but that's for like doing polishing the finish between coats. For normal sanding, it's 60, 120, 180, and 220. I think I might have the other ones, but I don't use them much. So just find what works for you in the woods you normally work with. Let's change angles. You want to jump from to the other side? And I'll talk over here, then I'll look there. So like it looks all woo. We got two cameras. And talking about not spending more time sanding than you need to, another place where we lose a lot of time and money is sanding way, way higher in the grits than we need to. Going back to looking at the directions on the label of the can, most finishes recommend you sand to either 120 to 220, just kind of depending, especially when you're doing a film finish. So that would be a finish that builds on top of builds a film on top of the wood. It really doesn't matter, you know, if you've polished your wood to 400 grit or not, because you're not gonna fill the wood. You're gonna fill the plastic garbage you put on top of it. Well, not garbage, but that plastic finish is what you're filling, not the wood. So who cares how smooth it is? In fact, it can be detrimental to the quality of the finish to sand it to too high of a grit because you've burnished or polished the wood. All those grains are now nice and flat because finish doesn't magically adhere itself to the wood unless it's some type of penetrating finish. And even then, a penetrating finish needs to be able to soak in. If you've burnished the wood, it can't soak in deep. It's not going to give you much protection. Likewise, if you've burnished the wood and you're trying to apply a film finish that sits on top of it, and it's totally burnished and smooth and polished, when it dries or cures, it doesn't have any nooks and crannies to kind of get its little hooks into to really grab onto the wood. You might have flaking and adherence issues or just durability issues because it's not as strongly bonded as it could or should be, which also goes back to dusting real well. But that's more of like an applying finish video. We're getting a little out of sanding, but that applying finish video will be coming out soon, so watch for that if you're interested in it. But yeah, look at the directions on your can and know how high to sand to. If I do oil finishes, I'm normally sanding or finishes that soak into the wood. I'll stop about 180 or 220, just kind of depends on how the wood is looking, how my scratch marks are, and exactly what finish I'm doing. If it has a film element, like I use Halcyon a lot, so with Halcyon I'm fine at 180. If I'm doing general finishes, Armor Seal, which is an oil that penetrates but also sits on top some, it's kind of like a Danish oil. I might go to 220 sometimes, so I think it recommends like 150, and that just comes with experience with products you're used to using and woods you're used to using. So with that, also when I'm talking about finishing again, find a product you like and stick with it so you know it and learn it. If every time you do a project you're switching finishes, it's not necessarily bad, but it's gonna get really hard to get good with one and really figure out how to sand properly for that finish. If you only ever use it once and then move on, you never get to go through that learning process. Anything I'm missing? Check my notes again. If you're struggling with, you know, maintaining equal spacing and being able to see sanding lines disappear, a good technique is get a pencil. This is like the only time I use these fat carpenter pencils, but that's a conversation for another video I've made many times. And then just sand until your pencil marks go away. If your pencil mark goes away, you've probably sanded it effectively enough to remove the previous grit scratches, and you're ready to move on to the next grit. So you do this between each grit, not just once and then go through all the grits till it's gone. You're not sanding well then. Use this as a guide for each grit to know I have effectively sanded this piece. And with that, you're just talking a light. Don't try to like really dig that graphite into the pores. It's just gonna make extra sanding for you to make those go away. So there's seldom a reason to sand your project above 220 before you apply finish. Of course, there's always an exception. So let's say you really do know your finishes and you're using a nice oil-based finish, you're doing a French polish, some kind of shellac, whatever, a finish that's gonna be compatible with a burnished wood, and you have some really figured, beautiful wood, and you really wanna show off the vibrance and all the chatoyance there and everything, you might want to sand that up to a nice 500 or 600 to really draw all that character out. But that's the exception, not the rule. If you're typically sanding to 4, 5, 6, 800, slapping on just some polyurethane, you're actually undercutting your polyurethane, and what you might be doing is trying to chase scratches, you know, that you established in your first grit that you just never got out before. But yeah, don't sand too high. You're just wasting time, wasting money. Last but not least, this one is slightly controversial. I'll talk about why. That's popping your grain when you finish. So right now this feels really nice, but wood is a hygroscopic material. Its moisture content changes based on the humidity in the air, the ambient or relevant humidity. Obviously, if I spray water on it, that's super humid and it's gonna suck some up and it's gonna change. Well, all those little fibers in the wood that's here that were smooth, some of them are gonna absorb that and kind of swell up and get kind of fuzzy and puffy. And then even once they dry, instead of laying nice where they were before, they're like, hey, check me out, I'm erect and you can feel me. Well, it's not the nice smooth finish you want on your wood. Fortunately for us in the environment, water-based finishes have come a long, long way, and we keep developing more and better ones. But they have water in them, so they're gonna raise the grain or pop the grain when you put them on. So what's so great if they feel fuzzy? Well, they don't have to. You just have to sand properly to prepare for them. And that is, I use 50-50. So this is half water, half denatured alcohol. I use the alcohol because it helps evaporate quicker, because if you just put water, it can take a long time to evaporate. Whatever I'm sanding to, let's say I'm sanding to 180, whatever step before my final grit, so if I'm sanding 120 then 180, I'll sand 120. I'll hit my project with the 50-50, let it dry, and the reason, or at least make sure it's really nice and moist, and then hopefully let it dry. Sometimes I'm patient, as long as I know it's sucked in and I can feel that the grain is raised, then I'll go ahead and sand it with 180. And what's happened is now the wood has, whatever's gonna raise when it gets wet has already done such, and I've removed those. And now when water gets applied again in that water-based finish, it's not gonna pop again unless I sand through all of that. So if you ever think, oh, I've sanded this and it feels great, and you put on finish and you're like, why is my wood, it doesn't feel smooth, it's kind of fuzzy, because you didn't pop the grain. Now, that's what water does. So arguably, if you're using an oil-based finish, there's no need for that. However, I like to do it just as a habit, because I've still noticed sometimes with oil-based finishes, I still kind of seem to get, you know, that fuzziness. Or maybe I'm just sanding bad and missed a spot, I don't know. But I like to go ahead and pop the grain, even if I'm using an oil-based finish. I mean, belt and suspenders, it doesn't hurt anything. So I'll leave you with that, and that's something I normally mention in all my projects if I talk about the sanding, is pop the grain. Can make a big difference in your final project. And that's what I've got to say about sanding. I also did a video about filling voids in wood, breaking down, you know, what finishes or what void fillers are stainable, not stainable, structural, not structural, best use cases for different ones and all that. If you're interested, that video is linked below, and I'm probably going to do one on finishing mistakes and getting the best out of your finish. If you're interested in that, make sure you keep your eyes peeled. If you're the kind of person who likes to like, comment, subscribe, do all those things, thank you so much. That really helps a lot. If you feel I've missed something or just strongly disagree with anything I had to say, feel free to leave that in a comment below and hit the like button. Otherwise, thank you for watching the video. I hope you learned something, were inspired, or at least a little entertained. And until next time, make time to make something.